And props to the new guy that came up on his first night. I've never seen that before. That's incredible. Good job. Very good job. And for any other newcomers in the crowd, thank you for being here. I know sometimes that first time is super scary. You feel like you're the biggest hot mess ever, and trust me, after you hear this tonight, you'll know that you're not. So I did this testimony about 7 months ago. I had hit a point in my recovery where it was time. Like, usually when you do your recovery, like the testimony part, like that's your pinnacle, right? That's the part where we're all working for. So I had finally reached that part, and I was good. So much has happened in 7 months, guys. So after I'm done with this, there's gonna be like a small, part 2, yes, that's what we're going to call it. There's going to be a small part 2 after that. Just so you can see how God, as soon as you get comfortable, he's like, no, you're not. So, just heads up, that's coming. So, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who's been delivered from a meth addiction and currently picking up the pieces of a dysfunctional childhood, early adulthood, and most recently, leaving an abusive relationship. My name is Anisa.
Hey, Anisa.
My story of recovery is a total roller coaster, and the only thing that I can offer is buckle up. I was born the first child in my family. Most wouldn't believe this to be too significant, except in efforts to prove that she loved me, I would be told so many times by my mother that she had to fight tooth and nail just to have me. I don't remember a lot of my childhood specifically. I do remember those words being in conversation so many times though. Whether it be to get me to behave a certain way, think a certain way, or even just an everyday conversation. Still to this day, I do not understand why the manipulation took the place of simply just telling me that I was loved and cared for. This would occur at the same time as my father's rageful rants about how getting married and having kids were probably the biggest mistakes he'd ever made in his life. See how that translated? Being a tiny human and just learning the world with a codependent, love-starved mother and an emotionally disabled and chronically angry father, this translated to, I'm a mistake and I've ruined their lives. My family suffered a traumatic blow when I was 3 years old. My aunt, who was my father's best friend and little sister, along with being a big part of my life, she passed away. I was too young at the time to understand what happened, but would learn later in childhood through eavesdropping on adult conversation, because that's what kids do, that she was murdered over drugs. She was an active cocaine addict. Those same conversations told me she was also keeping toxic relationships that would have her in and out of my grandparents' house, running home to escape the abuse. Now, as an adult, even though I was way too young for my aunt's decisions to impact me directly, looking back, the similarities between my life and how I've lived and her life, even though she passed away when I was 3, are uncanny and sometimes downright scary. To add this to the stress of the family trauma, my mom was very early in her pregnancy with my next sister, Tiffany, at my aunt's service. My sister, Tiffany, was born later that year, and a short time later, after a birth control fail, my sister Caitlin was born. You can probably tell by judging how my dad's reaction to me was, how he felt about the other 2. My family life grew very toxic and hard to maneuver. We never knew what kind of mood my dad was going to be in. Will he be fun? Will he be angry? Will he ignore me? Will I be screamed at? We attended church with my mother. My dad was a self-proclaimed non-believer. One of my earliest memories of being in trouble and being screamed at was after bouncing down the basement stairs to see him after church one day and telling him that God was my father. I ended up getting grounded for that. Over the next 4 to 5 years, my mom grew increasingly depressed and my dad got angrier. For a short time, my parents split up and we moved in with my grandparents. I felt peace in those few weeks. Eventually, though, we went back. My dad jumped from job to job while mom worked multiple at a time to make ends meet. Financial troubles were not kept quiet in our house. There were constant fights about money. Watching my mom write and rewrite on notebook paper the bills, hoping that the numbers would add up just a little bit differently every time. I will say, though, that we never lost power, water, vehicles, or went without any of the necessities. And today that kind of makes me resent the trauma of overhearing that stuff, what that caused for me. We knew and we were exposed to way too much. Coasting through childhood and into teenage years proved hard. I started having toxic friendships and relationships. Being involved in sports was my refuge, even though I hardly had a present parent. And when I did, it was made very obvious that they were annoyed that they had to be at my games. My junior year of high school was the worst for me. A relationship with an older man resulted in a very traumatic experience that ended with me labeled a liar, an attention seeker, and it caused me to withdraw from school because of the lack of support and safety I had there. I was shipped off to live with my aunt and uncle in another town until I could start school again in the fall. My senior year went about as good as it could be as a damaged teen. I barely made the grades to graduate, but I did graduate. The couple years after high school were just as chaotic, finding myself in more toxic relationships, failing out of college, losing friends to the war after 9/11. It was during this time I was at a party, drinking and doing the things young ones would do. A girl who was a local drug dealer had meth available. I had heard about it through the circle of friends that I was keeping, but being the baby of the group, this friends group always tried to keep me away from it, avoid it. Don't give it to her, she's too young, we don't want her on that stuff. Looking back now and noticing it, this theme has always been in my life. I've always been the youngest in my group of friends. It's still kind of like that today. Only friends today are way healthier. Still older, but way healthier. Looking back in self-reflection through a step study, I realized that I have constantly been seeking replacement parents. Ones that could reparent me and maybe heal the hurt that I've carried with me my whole life. Anyway, back to that party, intrigue got the best of me, and I tried. That was all it took, and there was no going back. The next 5 years of my life was a complete blur. Dangerous situations I'm lucky to have lived through, a lifestyle of crime and addiction. I completely turned my back on God, but with all the situations that I've managed to actually survive and live through, I now know He was definitely there. July 18, 2009, everything changed. The man I was with, the one who taught me how to deal and make methamphetamine, was in one of his rages. The neighbors in the apartment next to us called the police. During the welfare check, we had forgotten to kick some of the paraphernalia under the couch. It was grounds to search. Before I knew it, I was sitting on the hot sidewalk in handcuffs, waiting to be taken to the Elkhart County Jail. That night, as I was taken into my cell, I had 22 years worth of charges over my head. Scared was an understatement. 24-year-old kid, all I ever had was a speeding ticket, and I had that much time over my head. I was scared to death. After my time in county, I was given a 10-year sentence in the Indiana Department of Corrections. I was to serve 6 and do the remaining 4 on probation. When I got to prison, I made the decision to work my tail off and get back home. And I did just that. Exactly 2 years later, I was home early and able to start my probation and live outside of prison gates. My family had changed a lot over the years I was gone. My dad had calmed down a lot. Both my sisters had had children. I was an aunt. My mom was still her codependent self, but I let her love me because I so desperately needed it as I was rebuilding my life. A few months later, right after I got off house arrest, I met a man. We clicked instantly. A whirlwind relationship turned into a marriage, and I felt like I was finally becoming who I needed to be my whole life. I was being redeemed. It's from a man. You guys see? Do you see the sickness? Looking back now, I see that the redemption that I was looking for was in the world and not God, though. A few years into this marriage, I woke up to a loud crash in our bathroom. The door was locked and I couldn't get in. I had to run outside and climb on top of an air conditioning unit to see inside. It's comical now, but at the time it was terrifying. So I had to climb on top of the air conditioning unit to be able to see inside this tiny window into our bathroom. I was able to jimmy the window open while the neighbor across the street climbed through. We found my husband looking almost dead on the floor. After the ambulance arrived and telling them he was a perfectly healthy 36-year-old man, this was a seizure or something, and then I just kind of stepped back and let them do their job to revive him. After a few minutes, though, he was awake because of Narcan. That was the day that I found out my husband was a heroin addict. Whew, this is how I had also found out he'd been using most of our marriage behind my back. The addict had inadvertently married another addict. The next 5 years of my marriage was absolute horror, almost worse than my own personal addiction. I adopted my mother's codependent behavior and efforts to save my husband, drove myself absolutely crazy in the process because at the time he was not ready or willing. Multiple rehabs, multiple scary detoxes on the bedroom floor, the basement floor, anywhere that I could get him where I could keep eyes on him. So many times I thought he was going to die right there in my arms, only to get him to be clean for a few days at a time, and then he would just sneak out and use again. I was beating a dead horse. Those were the years that I actually found Celebrate Recovery, though. He found it. I went to be a support because I was fine. I didn't need it. I was clean. I'd been clean like 10 years at that point. So I went for him. What I found, though, was a support that I had never experienced in my life. I found strength in friendship, healthy friendships. I was given a purpose and rose in leadership very quickly. As I was growing, though, my husband was sinking further and further behind me. Through my growth, I finally had the strength to file for divorce. And at the end of the relationship, and the insanity of my codependency. Kind of. You see, in growing in leadership comes responsibility, work, and expectations. Or so I thought. Unfortunately, this particular recovery group burned me out, disrespected my boundaries, and eventually I turned completely away from recovery, church, and God. I was mad, I was hurt, newly divorced, I felt judged and betrayed. For 2 years, I vehemently denied God. I tossed out all my books and Bibles and turned to witchcraft and tarot. I needed to fill that void left from the betrayal of my former church and my divorce. I was on a slippery slope and fading fast. I am so grateful to this day that I wasn't exposed to drugs again. Being out of the game for so long, like I wouldn't know where to go or anything anymore, thank God, because if it was in front of me, I would have used. In November of last year, I lost my uncle. He was a pivotal part in my early recovery, more of a father to me than my actual father, because he was also in recovery himself. The day that he died, he had 33 years clean from alcohol. Yeah. He was the one that would pick me up on house arrest and take me all over Elkhart County to meetings, make sure that I would go, haul me into probation meetings, and just basically was like, hey, welcome to the black sheep club of the family. I love you. We're going to do this together. So he was a big part of my life. So losing him in last November, was very traumatic because it wasn't expected. I was crushed. But in true Anisa fashion, though, I took it out on God, because what else was I going to do? I just got even more angrier and deeper into my insanity. In January of last year, I finally lost it. I hit rock bottom and discovered I can make my life completely unmanageable without drugs. I had hit a new level. I was constantly angry, depressed, and almost psychotic in the way that I was thinking. One day I woke up, decided to quit my job, kick my fiance out of the house, shut out my friends and family. Now, if you know me, I'm a crazy cat lady. I tried to give my cats away. That's how bad it was. I was so far in my head, I was imagining them conspiring against me. It was really bad. It was completely unmanageable and at my own doing without drugs. My first round of CR gifted me with one of the most special people in my life, my sponsor. She kept in touch with me even though I turned my back on everything during those 2 years. She remained my friend. I knew at this point I needed to reach out, and she accepted me into her home with loving arms as an alternative to a grippy sock vacation otherwise known as the mental hospital. She knew what I needed more than they would have anyway. The Lord moves her in so many ways that I can't even explain. In just a few weeks, I was actively back into CR, never at her pushing, never at her suggestion. I just knew that it's where I needed to be because I knew that it worked the first time around. But going back to CR meant I had to step back into a church. I was so scared. I had to make my feet move through that door and step back into a church. It's terrifying. But again, I knew the program worked. I went from saying flat out in small group on the first few nights that I was back that I didn't want to be there. I was refusing to say that I was a grateful believer in anything. I was just full of rebellion and rage still, but I still went. Over the last year and a half of being back in Celebrate Recovery, I've become closer to God again. I've forgiven myself for the insanity I've made into my life, dealt with the crippling grief of losing my uncle, and completely renounced the craft that I was dabbling in. Throwing my witchcraft books and tarot cards into the trash was probably the most freeing feeling. I know Jesus was there. If you receive anything out of my testimony, my prayer is that you see God never gives up. He is strong enough and loves you enough to ride your roller coaster. If you find yourself straying, He's going with you whether you like it or not. And I'm just one of the many of the ones He left for the 99 to run after, and so are you. So that was in August, and 2 days later, after I gave this, I reached that pinnacle, guys. I hit the top. I was good. I was done. I could coast. 2 days later, I was in a very severe car accident. Someone had ran a red light and T-boned my Jeep. Completely totaled it. I broke 11 bones, popped a lung. I was in Memorial Hospital in South Bend for 6 days in the ICU. Completely had to learn how to be a human again for a little bit. For me, I'm very type A, I'm very go-getter. I work 2 jobs, I go to school. I am a performance-driven codependent. So for me to be stopped like that and have my life come to a complete halt like that was torture, absolute torture. But I learned so much in those few months of not being able to do anything but lay there. I couldn't clean, I couldn't do anything around my house. It was in that time of being home and still I realized that the relationship that I was in was toxic and abusive, and the things that he was doing to me was not normal, it was not healthy, and it was not an environment that I needed to be in. And in October of last year, still broken, I was able to leave that relationship. I have always been stuck at a dead-end job. And it's so funny how when you make the decision to start moving, God speeds things up a bit. I had been stuck at a dead-end job for about 12 years because I was carrying the shame and the guilt of my felony charges. I didn't think I deserved any better, so I stayed there. While I was in the hospital, I got a call from the mental health center in our community offering me a job. So that is where I currently work. I work in the mental health field now, I intended to work with other addicts because that's my wheelhouse, my expertise. And they put me on the intensive case unit where I get to work with people who are severely mentally ill, schizophrenics, borderline personality disorder, like that. I have found my niche. I have found my people. I have found my passion, and I get to tie my own recovery into that. So yeah, it hurts a little bit navigating single life again at 40 years old, but I am more fulfilled now. I know what a healthy relationship looks like now. I know what to look for now. And I have this program, my church, and the friends and family that I have brought along with me on this ride to thank for that. So thank you guys too.